Sometimes criminals are capable of displaying extraordinary cruelty, but it's even more terrifying when they start instilling their distorted worldview in the younger generation. Today's story shows what simple curiosity combined with incitement from elders can lead to. October 31st, 2005 was a busy day for 25-year-old photographer Teresa Halbach. Her home was located in Hilbert, Wisconsin, USA, but today she left it and headed east, as she had 3 meetings scheduled. First and foremost, Teresa had to take photos of used cars for a magazine that specialized in selling them. She had started her own small business. The girl set off in her blue 1999 Toyota RAV4. The first of these meetings was to take place near Lake Michigan in Gibson, Wisconsin, which was 50 kilometers from her home. This is where Teresa was to meet 43-year-old Stephen Avery. Teresa planned to take several photos of a minivan he intended to sell through her magazine. In fact, the girl's car often visited this lot, as she collaborated with the owner, and cars regularly appeared here for publication. There was another trip ahead, for which Teresa was to receive $40, and then 2 more meetings related to her work. But after this meeting, the girl never returned home. Teresa Halbach grew up in a large family in the farming town of St. John, Wisconsin, becoming the second of 5 children in the family. From a young age, she helped her parents around the farm, as there was always plenty of work on the dairy farm they owned. Mostly, Teresa was engaged in milking cows. She adored animals. Teresa graduated with honors from the University of Wisconsin in 2002. She obtained a degree in photography, always distinguished by an extraordinary talent and a passion for art, and was the true pride of the family. Teresa's love for photography manifested from an early age. While still in high school, she worked part-time at a private photo studio, photographing children and festive events. Later, Teresa interned at one of the city's companies that was engaged in photography. After her studies, she managed to get a job at a photo studio, for which she moved to Green Bay. Teresa most enjoyed photographing young children. Many acquaintances and colleagues said that she had a real gift, thanks to which she could calm even the most restless child. The girl also worked part-time as a coach for the volleyball team at St. John's School, working with junior students. She was known as a kind and very calm girl with a true teaching talent. Teresa had always dreamed of opening her own studio, and at one point decided to take this step. Unfortunately, at first things were not going very well. The income was irregular, so she was forced to return to her parents' home, but did not abandon this business. During this period, Teresa had to travel a lot to fulfill various orders, so she acquired a car. It was an unstable job, but the girl hoped that things would get better with time. Here she took up photographing used cars for the magazine, which helped her stay afloat. For this, she collaborated with the Avery Auto Salvage in Gibson, where there were about 4,000 used cars. On the territory of this organization, there were several outbuildings, a garage, a barn, and also a mobile trailer where the owner, named Stephen Avery, lived. His brothers also helped him. His family owned several hundred acres of land in this area. Even the road passing through this place was named after them, Avery Road. Stephen had recently returned to the family business, as he had spent a long time in prison. In 1985, he was found guilty of raping and beating a 36-year-old woman named Penny Burnson, whom he allegedly caught while she was jogging. She was training on trails along Lake Michigan. This happened in a neighboring town, and the woman identified him. But Stephen had an alibi. He was 50 kilometers from the attack site in Green Bay. The alibi was confirmed by a store receipt with a timestamp and witnesses. The case was very controversial and caused a great public outcry. Many at that time did not believe in the man's guilt. Despite the fact that Stephen insisted on his innocence from the very beginning, he was convicted of attempted murder, rape, and false imprisonment. The man was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Stephen immediately filed an appeal. He referred to DNA tests that were obtained after the attack. In all the materials collected by forensic experts, there were indeed no traces of him. Unfortunately, the analysis technologies of those times were far from modern capabilities, so the prosecution managed to smooth over this gap in the tactics of the accusation. In 1996, the court rejected the convict's appeal, but his case was transferred to the Wisconsin Innocence Project, which fought for the freedom of wrongfully convicted people. The lawyers of this organization were able to convince the court of the need to review the case. Eventually, innovative DNA analysis technologies made it possible to prove that the samples collected from the raped victim did not belong to Stephen. In fact, the police database even found a profile match with Gregory Allen, who at that time was already serving a 60-year sentence on charges of assault and rape. This man lived in the same area as Stephen, who was convicted due to a judicial error, and they looked very similar. On September 10, 2003, the court decided to release the innocent man from behind bars. By that time, his wife had divorced him and taken the children. This case was widely covered in the media. The man had unfairly served 18 years, lost his family, after which he filed a lawsuit for $36 million for wrongful conviction. At that time, the lawsuit was still under consideration. In fact, the Teresa was aware of Stephen's struggle with the error of the judicial system. Teresa also believed in his innocence and trusted him, because she repeatedly came alone to this used car lot. However, she was clearly not well acquainted with the criminal past of the owner of the auto salvage, which he had managed to accumulate before that arrest. From the age of 18, Stephen had serious problems with the law. He was involved in several episodes of robberies, as well as cruel treatment of animals. Once he doused a cat with gasoline and set it on fire, after which he simply watched the innocent animal die. For these crimes, he served several short terms. However, the degree of violence was growing, and more serious criminal episodes began to appear in his history. In January 1985, he beat a female law enforcement officer on the road and pointed a gun at her, threatening to kill her. However, he retreated when he saw the woman's little daughter in the back seat of the car. For this attack, he received 6 years in prison. In the summer of the same year, while he was out on bail awaiting trial, the attack on Penny Burnson occurred, for which he was wrongfully convicted. In fact, there were several people in Stephen's family who had problems with the law. For example, his older brother Chuck had been convicted several times, including for attacking his ex-wife and attempting to kill her, which he did not even deny. They had a very tense relationship. The man drank and often lashed out at his wife. When he attacked her and almost strangled her during another binge, she turned to the police. Despite the brutality of the crime, he received only a year and a half of probation. Both brothers worked at the auto salvage and were dubious individuals. But unfortunately, Teresa did not realize who she was getting involved with and went to meet with them on October 31, 2005, after which she disappeared. On November 3, 2005, Teresa's mother, Karen Halbach, called the county sheriff's department and stated that her daughter had not been home for 3 days. At the same time, the woman could not get through to Teresa, which was completely uncharacteristic of her. The girl tried to develop her small business, had to maintain contact with clients every day, but even without that, she never disappeared from the radar for more than a day. The woman contacted the owner of the auto salvage, but he replied that he did not know where Teresa was. Then the mother turned to the police. After this case was made public, the search for the girl began. Police officers immediately reported what had happened on television. Leaflets were distributed. Relatives of the missing woman disseminated information about Teresa herself and her car. Detectives established that on the day of her disappearance, Teresa never showed up at other meetings and disappeared immediately after the trip to the auto salvage. On November 5th, police officers arrived at the Avery car lot and asked one of the owners, Earl Avery, for permission to inspect the area. The man allowed them to do so. After searching about 50 cars, a blue Toyota was found that looked very similar to Teresa's vehicle. It was located in a remote part of the lot, turned out to be locked and without license plates. The car was covered with tree branches and other spare parts. It seemed to have been deliberately hidden there. After checking, it was confirmed that this vehicle did indeed belong to the missing girl. The Toyota was confiscated and sent to the laboratory for thorough examination. Forensic experts also searched Stephen's trailer and found a stain that looked like blood. It was located in the bathroom. Forensic experts immediately collected materials for analysis. After further searches in Stephen's bedroom, a semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle was found, as well as a powder charging device. In one of the garages on the lot, 11 spent cartridges were found that were clearly fired from the owner's rifle. On the third day of the search, the key to Teresa's car was found in the trailer. By this time, the police had already found traces of blood in the trunk and rear of the Toyota. All materials were sent for analysis. License plates from Teresa's vehicle were found on November 8th. They were lying in a pile of scrap metal and were very crumpled. It was assumed that the criminal hoped that they would not be detected before disposal. However, an even more important find was a metal garbage barrel in which burned clothing was found, similar to the one described in which Teresa left home for the last time. A camera, a mobile phone, as well as some other items, including an almost completely burned shovel, also burned here. In the second large bonfire located on the territory of the auto salvage, fragments of bones and teeth were found. A forensic anthropologist examined these remains and determined that they belonged to a girl aged 25 to 30. It was assumed that they were left after the body was burned. Experts believed that the body was probably mutilated and deliberately destroyed to conceal traces. Numerous traces of Stephen were found in Teresa's Toyota: hair, sweat, and skin particles. In addition, there was blood of the missing woman here. After all these findings, the case was reclassified from disappearance to murder. Stephen Avery was taken to the police station. Of course, during the interrogation, he denied his involvement in the girl's disappearance. According to the man, he had never been in Teresa's car. However, he admitted that the girl had come to the lot between 2 and 2:30 p.m. on October 31st. It was a scheduled meeting. According to him, Stephen was present while Teresa was photographing the minivan, after which he paid her $40 in cash. The photographer gave him a sample of the magazine, and then left. Stephen claimed that he did not see her leave, but no one believed this story, because the missing woman's car and many traces indicated that Teresa was attacked right at the lot. On November 9th, Stephen was arrested and charged with illegal possession of weapons. The investigation into Teresa's murder continued. The investigation was convinced that Stephen was involved in the massacre, but it was necessary to link together all the collected evidence, which took some time. By that time, the suspect was already quite famous due to the previous process. What happened attracted many journalists. Everyone wanted a sensation. Stephen spoke to the press. During the interview, he accused the police of initiating this persecution in response to his lawsuit for compensation. He believed that they would try to frame him for the second time, and that it was some kind of conspiracy. At the same time, the man did not dispute that some terrible crime could indeed have occurred on the territory of his lot. But according to him, the auto salvage was never locked or isolated. In fact, anyone who knew about it could get in here, commit a massacre, and try to get rid of the traces of the crime. The convict's brother supported these assumptions. Nevertheless, on November 15, 2005, Stephen was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. At the preliminary hearings, the court set bail at $500,000. The lawyer insisted that what happened was nothing more than an attempt to tarnish Stephen's reputation in order to deny him a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. However, according to the prosecution, for these tasks at a minimum, it was necessary to somehow obtain his hair, skin particles, and sweat, which of course was impossible without his participation. After the indictment, the Innocence Project, which had previously allowed the wrongfully convicted to achieve justice, was literally overwhelmed with appeals from concerned citizens who demanded the release of innocent Stephen. People were convinced that he had once again become a victim of police arbitrariness. Meanwhile, detectives continued to search for answers to questions related to Teresa's death. Despite the large amount of evidence, the details of this crime were still fragmentary. To put the picture together, the investigation actively communicated with the Avery family, their friends and acquaintances. One of the witnesses was his 16-year-old nephew named Brendan Dassey. He lived in a small trailer located on the territory of the auto salvage. On February 27, 2006, the boy was called in for re-interrogation, as investigators believed that the young man was withholding too much. He again did not confess to anything, but was called again. This time, the high school student admitted that together with his uncle, he participated in the rape, torture, and murder of Teresa. According to the teenager's confession, on October 31st, he returned from school around 3:45 p.m. Brendan lived near his uncle's trailer and found a letter for him when he checked the mailbox. When the young man approached his trailer to hand over the envelope, he heard a female voice from inside asking for help. Next to the trailer was a metal barrel in which a fire was burning. The teenager noticed that in the flames there was a melted mobile phone and a camera. All this was covered with women's clothing, which had almost completely burned out. Brendan waited quite a long time for an answer from his uncle. Finally, Stephen opened the door for him. The man invited his nephew into the kitchen and then offered to take advantage of his captive. Inside the bedroom, the schoolboy saw a naked Teresa, who was chained to the bed with handcuffs and shackles. Stephen said that he had already raped the girl several times and was going to continue doing so. The captive begged for salvation. She asked Brendan to persuade his uncle to let her go, but instead the teenager also raped Teresa. According to the young man's confession, Stephen watched the process. After that, they watched TV for about 10 to 15 minutes. The uncle praised the boy for how he committed the rape. Next, they discussed the murder and how to get rid of the body. Having agreed on a plan of action, the criminals took up knives. Stephen stabbed the victim in the stomach and ordered his nephew to cut her throat. The high school student obeyed. Then they cut off several strands of hair from the deceased. The uncle strangled the girl with her throat cut in front of his nephew. This lasted several minutes. The man told the boy that he wanted to make sure she was dead, although it was obvious. Therefore, he assumed that Stephen rather enjoyed this process. Further, the body in the trunk of the girl's car was taken to the garage, where Stephen shot her about 10 times. He fired 4 bullets into her head alone, and the rest hit her body. Afterwards, the body was thrown into a large fire that was already burning on the territory. To intensify the flames, several tires were thrown into it. After that, the killers hid the car, covered it with branches, while the body was burning out, and they tried to wash off the traces of blood with gasoline and solvent. Then Stephen took the victim's vehicle, threw out the license plates, and took the keys. When the body burned, Stephen broke several bones that survived with a shovel and buried them in another place on the lot. This happened the same evening, but it took place in the dark, so the young man could not remember the exact place. Later, a burial with Teresa's charred bones was indeed found on the territory of the auto salvage. When Brendan's relatives were asked if the teenager could have done everything he told about, the man doubted the truthfulness of his words. In fact, Brendan had developmental delays and a low IQ. According to relatives, the young man was not independent. He always needed to be told what to do, and he simply obeyed. In addition, the teenager loved to make up strange stories, which he often passed off as the truth. So the relatives were convinced that this story turned out to be another figment of his imagination, nothing more. Nevertheless, the evidence confirmed the teenager's story. Stephen's nephew was arrested. On June 30th, 2006, Brendan wrote a letter to the county judge. He began by saying that he had wanted to write earlier, but could not, because he did not have a pen or pencil. In this letter, he renounced his previous words and said that on the 31st, he and his uncle were riding a golf cart around the territory and collecting garbage for burning. They did not commit any murder or rape. Of course, this note was not taken seriously, especially since many of Brendan's statements were confirmed. The trial of the young man was scheduled for April 2007. If he was found guilty, he could receive life imprisonment, plus another 72.5 years. The date of Stephen Avery's trial was set for February 5, 2007. The man was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, rape, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment, as well as mutilating the body. In addition, he was charged with possession of weapons. If found guilty on all counts, he could receive life imprisonment plus 128.5 years. The key witness for the prosecution was the forensic expert, since the remains of the victim were fragmentary, consisting of broken bones and teeth in poor condition. During the analysis, the specialist found traces of several gunshot wounds on the fragments of the victim's skull. Unfortunately, due to the condition of the remains, it was never determined whether they were inflicted post-mortem or caused her death. In the garage on the territory of the auto salvage, a bullet with traces of Teresa's DNA, spots of her blood, a burned phone and camera, a car, keys, and many other traces were found that confirmed Brendan's initial testimony, which he later recanted. The nephew refused to testify against Stephen in court, which harmed him, because after this refusal, the young man lost the opportunity to mitigate the sentence. The defenders tried with all their might to cast doubt on the prosecution's version. An alternative story was voiced, according to which law enforcement officers carefully prepared to frame Stephen for his $36 million lawsuit in order not to pay the funds. They were able to gain access to the lot, use the investigative materials obtained during the investigation of the rape case for which the defendant was illegally accused, all because a vial of his blood disappeared from his previous case. Discussion of the case materials took about 20 hours. On March 18, 2007, the jury found Stephen guilty of intentional murder and illegal possession of a firearm. All the lawyers' arguments were found unconvincing. The defendant was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. Brendan's trial began on April 16, 2007. The 17-year-old teenager was charged with 3 counts: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating the body, and first-degree sexual assault with aggravating circumstances. Lawyers referred to the fact that the client had a low IQ, so the police were able to persuade him to give confessional testimony in order to achieve, first of all, Stephen's conviction. Despite Brendan's retraction of his initial testimony, police officers found a large amount of evidence that partially or completely confirmed the young man's first version. The boy was indeed found to have developmental disabilities, but he was aware of what was happening and thought rationally. The prosecutor's office was convinced that he changed his testimony on purpose, since he listened to the lawyer and hoped to avoid punishment. At the same time, no traces of the victim's DNA, his hair or blood, were found on Brendan's clothes. However, the prosecutor's office parried these statements, pointing to large spots of solvent. These spots appeared on the clothes while helping to clean up in his uncle's garage. It is known that this chemical destroys blood. The jury was shown video recordings of the teenager's confession, as well as several episodes of interrogations. In one of the recordings, he admitted that he just wanted to know what sex was, so he participated in the rape and then the massacre of the girl. He ended his initial confession with remorse and regret that he did not stop his uncle. The recording looked plausible. The teenager had no motive to make up this whole story. Brendan's sister, named Kayla, was invited as one of the witnesses. Earlier, when communicating with the police, she claimed that her brother told her the details of the committed massacre, but in court, he recanted his words. It seemed that this could harm the prosecution. The teenager's lawyers tried to prove that the police obtained the testimony by force and cunning. However, the detectives who conducted numerous interrogations with the young man insisted that, on the contrary, they tried to expose him in a lie when Brendan first told his story. They did not believe the boy, but he assured that everything happened just like that. The high school student repeatedly confirmed his words and was quite convincing. All this was also captured on tape, which was shown to the jury and was confirmed by the evidence. The young man only later recanted them when he was already in prison and realized how serious the situation was. The defense team allowed Brendan to appear in court, believing that his words could convince the jury. However, the prosecutor's office pointed out that most of the defendant's story is supported by physical evidence found on the lot. According to Brendan, he made several contradictory statements because he did not know that he was facing a serious term. He perceived it as some kind of game, which, according to the defenders, was due to his developmental disabilities. He could not explain why he decided to make up the story. By his own admission, the details of the crime were taken from some book. On April 26, 2007, the jury went to discuss Brendan's verdict. It took them 4.5 hours to determine that the young man was guilty on all counts. After the hearing ended, Brendan's mother left the courthouse. Reporters followed her. The woman refused to speak, but when she got into her SUV, she shouted to the journalists that she actually believed that Teresa's family had set it all up together with the police. Awaiting sentencing, Brendan was held in the county jail, one floor below where his uncle's cell was located, whom he feared. The young man spoke with reporters several times until the hype surrounding the case died down. He complained that since the charges were brought, he had begun to have problems with sleep, as well as difficulties with emotional background. Before that, he read a lot, but after the verdict, he could not pick up a book. The young man was facing life imprisonment. At this stage, the court had to determine whether he would retain the right to parole, and also when he could be released in this case. On August 2, 2007, Brendan Dassey again found himself in the courtroom to hear the final verdict. By court order, the young man will still receive the right to parole, but only after 41 years. In the final speech, the prosecutors reported that Brendan could have made a choice, but he leaned towards evil. He was aware of what was happening, understood the difference between good and evil. Therefore, he made a conscious decision to participate in the massacre of a young, innocent girl out of simple curiosity. The victim's relatives accused the young man of knowing what was happening. He could have at least tried to influence his uncle, persuade him to save her life, but he did nothing. In August 2016, a federal judge overturned Brendan's sentence on the grounds that his confession was obtained under duress. In June 2017, the prosecutor's office appealed this decision. 8 months later, a panel of 7 judges of the Court of Appeals, by a vote of 4-3, ruled in favor of maintaining the original sentence, ruling that the police had properly obtained the teenager's confession. Stephen and Brendan continue to file appeals, denying their guilt. During his last communication with reporters, Brendan Dassey admitted that he fears what other prisoners can do to him in prison. For this reason, he suffered from depression and constant fear. The young man claimed that he falls asleep in tears every night. Stephen's lawsuit was eventually settled. He was paid $400,000. Stephen Avery's ex-fiancée Jody reported in 2016 that she considers him guilty. In the past, he threatened to kill her and her family. The man stated that he became angry with all women after he was unfairly imprisoned because of the victim's testimony. And now, he will take revenge on all women. Stephen wrote her threatening letters from prison. Even now, disputes about the guilt of Stephen and Brendan do not subside. Some still believe that they were framed by the police. This chilling story about the murder of a young girl, Teresa Halbach, and the subsequent investigation demonstrates how complex and ambiguous criminal cases can be. Despite the large amount of evidence against Stephen Avery and his nephew Brendan Dassey, questions still remain about the fairness of their conviction. This case draws attention to problems in the justice system, such as the possibility of obtaining confessions under pressure, as well as the importance of carefully preserving and analyzing physical evidence. It also shows how public opinion can influence the course of an investigation and trial. If you are interested in this story and want to learn more about similar investigations, subscribe to the Detective Brooks channel. Here you will find many fascinating and intriguing criminal cases that will make you think about human nature and the search for justice.